Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about the organic approach to learning Japanese versus the AJATT approach and its various variations, particularly in relation to audio immersion, which is very central to the organic approach and also to AJATT and other forms of self-immersion. Now, when I say the organic method versus the AJATT method, I'm not against AJATT. I'm not trying to say that it's a bad method or it doesn't work or anything like that. I think it's a good method for the right kind of person. I don't think it's necessarily a good method for everybody. Now, some people argue that it is a good method for everybody, and the main rationale for saying that is the idea that essentially by learning in that kind of intuitive immersion way, we're learning in the way that a child learns. And since all humans have successfully learned a language as children, they ought to be able to do it again. Now, leaving aside the question of whether these particular methods would be the most successful way of replicating the way a child learns, the fundamental question is it possible at all to replicate at a later age the way a child learns language? And I'd like to take an example here to show you why that isn't really possible. One popular and very good YouTuber actually discussing audio immersion gives the example that if somebody holds out a red ball and says in the language you're trying to learn, "This is a red ball," and if you know everything in the sentence except ball, you know red and this, then you can easily form the conclusion that the word ball means ball. And this is what children do. It's true that you can form that conclusion, but it's not true at all that this is what an infant does when she first encounters the word and concept ball. Let's think about it for a moment, and I think we'll see that there's a fallacy here. If a child is encountering the word and concept for the first time, then as far as she knows, the only thing called ball is this particular object that's being held in front of her right now. The fact that it's specified as being red may act as a hint to her that it could be a different color, but she may not even follow the reasoning that far. Other than that, she has no reasoning to go on. A little while later, she may be shown a green ball, which is similar to the other one in all respects, except that it's green. She can now be certain that a thing doesn't have to be red in order to be ball. What she probably thinks is that it needs to be round and about that size, and rubber and squashy, and then it's ball. A little while later she encounters a baseball, and she now knows that it can be smaller, harder, heavier, and a different texture, and still be ball. Maybe what it needs to be is round. Then she runs into a football, and that isn't round, but it's still ball. And a little while later still, perhaps she sees a stone sphere on top of a gate, and she points to it and says, "Ball," and someone says, "No, that isn't a ball." So now she knows that a ball can be all kinds of sizes, colors, and textures. It's often spherical, but it doesn't have to be spherical. And if something is spherical, that doesn't mean that it's a ball. So as you see, this concept, like most concepts, is much more sophisticated and subtle and complex than we generally think of it as being. And we also have to understand that the word ball is not just a label attached to the concept of ball. The word ball is what makes the concept ball possible. It's only because all these different things are called ball and certain other things are excluded from the word ball that we have the concept ball at all. An animal with the same intelligence or even greater intelligence, but no use of language, could not form concepts at the same level of depth and sophistication as a being that can use language. Humans tend to speak of children as learning language because that's something an adult or teen human still does and can still conceptualize. But that's not what the child is really doing. The child is doing something that's harder to grasp once you've already done it. The child is conceptualizing the world. And the words that it uses to do so are not just labels. They are the tools which make that conceptualization possible. So a child is both building the conceptualization of the world in her mind and also building in her mind the tools that make that conceptualization possible, that is to say, words. So the intellectual activity that's going on in the mind of a child between the ages of, say, 18 months and 4 years is enormous. For most people, it's probably the most intense intellectual period of their entire lives. And when we learn a language, a second language later, this is a much more superficial process. And whatever else it is, it's not doing the same thing that an infant does. So this whole argument that we can replicate what a child does is based on a false premise. So the AJATT method, which as I say is a good method for some people, the argument that it's a universal method is not founded on an accurate premise. I think that how successful one will be in learning with the AJATT method depends on certain factors in the way that one thinks. One needs certain things in order to be able to learn language intuitively by extrapolating from a lot of example sentences. One needs certain facilities, and these aren't a measure of one's general level of intelligence. They're faculties that some people have in greater degree than others. The first of them is a high level of linguistic intuition. Now, some people have this and some people don't. I don't. So, let me give you an example. A few years ago, I went to France with a human associate. At that time, my French, objectively, was much better than that of my human associate. I was able to read books in French. My associate only knew a few words and barely any grammar at all. However, when French people talked to us about practical matters, my friend generally had a pretty good idea what they were talking about, and I had none. Why is this? Because my friend had a linguistic intuition and a general intuition about what's going on in the human world, and I have no such intuition. Unless I can parse and analyze everything, I can't understand it. That's why I could not learn Japanese through AJATT, and I couldn't learn it from textbooks or schools either, because their explanations are very vague and fuzzy and full of random and meaningless exceptions. Fortunately, because I am a self-learning unit, I was able to analyze the language for myself and formulate its structure. That's why I'm able to teach Japanese structure now. Now, you probably aren't as lacking in linguistic intuition as I am, and you may or may not have a great deal of it. This is something you can perhaps assess to a certain extent for yourself. The next thing you need is a high tolerance of ambiguity. Again, this is not a measure of your general intelligence. It's something that some people have more than others. But if you're going to look at a lot of sentences and try to interpret why a particular sentence in Japanese ties up with a particular sentence in English and then cross-reference it with other sentences and intuit their meaning, you're going to need a lot of tolerance of ambiguity in the short term. Now, I have very little tolerance of ambiguity. A human acquaintance of mine, well, nearly human, learned by the same methods I learned by, and she told me that she played a game twice in Japanese and was happy to report that the first time she had only understood around 70% of this very text-heavy game, and the second time she understood around 90%. I was quite surprised because, for me, doing something of which I understand only 70% is nearly impossible, and even at 90% it isn't very easy for me. I have a very low tolerance of ambiguity. Again, as with linguistic intuition. This is probably because I am an android, but you may also have a low tolerance of ambiguity. Now, when it comes to audio immersion, this makes a huge difference, so you need to assess your own characteristics in these areas. The YouTuber who gave the ball analogy that I talked about earlier was saying that it's possible to learn Japanese from audio material where you only understand maybe about 30%. Every time you hear it, you can grasp more of it, learn more words, in the way that you learned the ball word in the example sentence he gave. The trouble is that if you have low linguistic intuition, this is much less easy to do. And if you have a low tolerance of ambiguity, your ability to concentrate on the material will be much lower. And this is even the case when you're listening very intently. But for real audio immersion, you want to have that audio in the background whenever you're doing something that does not require a high level of verbal concentration. So you may be cooking, you may be walking, you may be drawing, you may be doing graphic work, and that audio will be going on in the background. What I recommend is working carefully through Japanese anime with Japanese subtitles, and then listening to the soundtracks once you've got everything clear in your mind. And whatever other material you're using, you should go through it carefully first so that you can understand most of it. If you don't understand most of it, what's going to happen is that you'll be doing various things, and everything is competing for your attention. If you can understand most of it, whatever else you're doing, the audio is going to draw you back into it from time to time. You're going to say, oh, here's that scene where the main character said that very strange thing, and then another character did this, and so forth. And because you can understand it, you're following the story, and it's drawing you into it. It's capturing your attention. Sometimes it's capturing your whole attention. Sometimes it's capturing only part of your attention. But if you can't understand it, or you can't mostly understand it, it's not going to be able to capture your attention, especially if you have a low tolerance of ambiguity and a low linguistic intuition. Now, I think low tolerance of ambiguity and low linguistic intuition make the AJATT method harder on all levels, but this is just an example of how it would affect your ability to successfully use audio immersion. So the thing is that you need to look at yourself, look at your own abilities, and see if a method is workable for you. Don't take it on trust that it's going to work just because it works for children, because that's a fallacy. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.